The morning sun cast long shadows across the military airfield as Sarah Martinez clutched her deployment orders with trembling fingers. The crisp paper felt heavier than it should, bearing the weight of everything she had worked toward for the past 8 years. Around her, dozens of soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, their boots creating a rhythmic symphony against the concrete as they prepared for deployment to overseas bases. Sarah's stomach churned with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. This was her first major deployment since joining the Army Medical Corps, and she had spent weeks preparing mentally and physically for this moment. Her medical bag sat at her feet, packed with supplies that could mean the difference between life and death for wounded soldiers in the field. Every instrument had been checked twice, every medication accounted for. The massive military transport jet loomed before them like a gray metal giant, its engines already humming with anticipation. Ground crews scurried around its perimeter, performing final safety checks and loading cargo. The sight should have filled Sarah with pride and purpose, but, instead, she found herself unconsciously touching the raised scar that ran along the left side of her neck. The scar had been with her for 12 years now, a permanent reminder of a car accident that had nearly claimed her life when she was just 18. The trauma had left her with more than just physical marks. 4 months afterward, she had struggled with panic attacks and anxiety, especially in crowded or stressful situations. It was those dark months of recovery that had ultimately led her to medicine, driven by the memory of the doctors and nurses who had saved her life. Martinez. The sharp voice of Sergeant Williams cut through her thoughts. Sarah snapped to attention, her medical bag bumping against her leg as she turned toward the gruff non-commissioned officer who had been overseeing their deployment preparations. "Yes, Sergeant." Sarah responded, her voice carrying the crisp authority that 8 years of military training had instilled in her. Sergeant Williams approached with his characteristic scowl, his weathered face showing the strain of managing dozens of soldiers preparing for deployment. Behind him walked Lieutenant Colonel Barnes, a man Sarah recognized but had never spoken to directly. Barnes carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen multiple deployments and understood the weight of sending soldiers into harm's way. "There's been a change to the manifest," Sergeant Williams announced, his voice carrying across the immediate area where Sarah and several other medical personnel stood waiting. "We're over capacity for this flight." Sarah's heart began to race, a familiar sensation that she had learned to manage over the years. The panic attacks from her youth had never completely disappeared, but she had developed coping mechanisms that allowed her to function effectively in high-stress situations. She took a slow, controlled breath and focused on maintaining her composure. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes stepped forward, his eyes scanning the group of medical personnel with practiced assessment. "We need to reduce the medical team by 2 members for this flight. There will be another transport in 48 hours. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. 48 hours meant missing the initial setup phase of the field hospital. It meant her team would have to manage without her during those crucial first days when wounded soldiers would begin arriving from forward positions. Every instinct in her body screamed that she needed to be on that plane. "Sir," Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "I volunteer to take the later flight if needed. My team can manage the initial setup without me." Barnes studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "That's admirable, Martinez, but we're not looking for volunteers. We're making selections based on mission requirements." Sergeant Williams consulted his clipboard, his finger tracing down a list of names. Sarah watched with growing dread as he seemed to consider each name carefully. She knew her record was exemplary. Her medical skills were among the best in her unit, and she had consistently received outstanding evaluations. But she also knew that military decisions were based on factors beyond individual performance. "Martinez and Johnson will take the second flight," Sergeant Williams announced finally. "Report to Captain Stevens for revised orders." The words seemed to echo in Sarah's ears as she watched her colleagues begin moving toward the aircraft. Dr. Patricia Chen, the senior medical officer for their unit, paused beside her and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's not a reflection on your abilities, Sarah," Dr. Chen said quietly. "Sometimes these decisions come down to logistics we can't see." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She understood the reality of military operations, but understanding didn't make the disappointment any easier to bear. She had spent weeks mentally preparing for this deployment, visualizing herself setting up the field hospital and providing critical care to wounded soldiers. Now she would be arriving late, feeling like she had let her team down before the mission even began. As she watched her colleagues board the aircraft, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. Private Johnson, who was also being left behind, was standing near the aircraft arguing with Sergeant Williams. His voice was rising, and she could see the frustration written across his face. But what disturbed her most was the way other personnel seemed to be giving both her and Johnson a wide berth. A sick realization began to form in her mind. Johnson was one of only 3 African American soldiers in their unit, and Sarah was the only Hispanic woman in the medical corps group. The 2 soldiers being left behind happened to be the most visible minorities in the group. She tried to push the thought away, telling herself she was being paranoid. The military had strict policies against discrimination, and she had never experienced anything overt during her 8 years of service. But the nagging doubt remained, growing stronger as she watched the boarding process continue. Captain Stevens approached her with a manila envelope containing her revised orders. He was a young officer, probably only a year or 2 older than Sarah, and he looked uncomfortable with the task he had been assigned. "I'm sorry about this, Martinez," he said, his voice genuinely apologetic. "I know how much this deployment meant to you." "It's part of the job, sir," Sarah replied, accepting the envelope with more grace than she felt. "When do we report for the next flight?" "Day after tomorrow, 0600 hours. Same preparation requirements." Stevens hesitated for a moment, as if he wanted to say something more, but then seemed to think better of it. "Is there anything you need in the meantime?" Sarah shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. Stevens nodded and walked away, leaving her standing alone on the tarmac as the sound of jet engines grew louder. The aircraft was preparing for takeoff, carrying her colleagues and her dreams of proving herself in the field. As she walked back toward the base buildings, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the window of a nearby hangar. The scar on her neck seemed more prominent than usual, a visible reminder of trauma and survival. She had overcome so much to reach this point in her career. The accident, the recovery, the years of medical training, the challenges of being a woman and a minority in a male-dominated field. But, standing there in the shadow of the departing aircraft, Sarah felt smaller than she had in years. The confident medical officer who had reported for deployment that morning had been replaced by a woman questioning whether she truly belonged in the uniform she wore with such pride. The sound of the jet engines reached a crescendo as the aircraft lifted off the runway, carrying her team toward their mission while she remained behind. Sarah watched until the plane disappeared into the morning sky, then turned and walked back toward the medical facility where she would spend the next 48 hours wondering if she was being paranoid or if something darker had influenced the decision to leave her behind. Inside the medical building, Sarah found herself alone in the break room, staring at her revised orders without really reading them. The words seemed to blur together as her mind raced through every interaction she had witnessed that morning. Had there been something in Sergeant Williams' expression when he looked at her? Had Barnes seemed uncomfortable making eye contact? Or was she simply looking for discrimination where none existed? The doubt gnawed at her as she replayed the morning's events. She thought about all the times she had worked twice as hard as her colleagues to prove herself, all the extra hours she had put in to ensure her medical skills were beyond question. She had believed that merit would always speak louder than prejudice, but now she wasn't so sure. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her younger brother Miguel, who was finishing his residency at a hospital in San Antonio. "Good luck on deployment, sis. Make us proud." The simple message brought tears to her eyes as she thought about her family's sacrifices to support her military career. Sarah's parents had immigrated from Mexico when she was 5 years old, working multiple jobs to provide opportunities for their children that they had never had themselves. Her father cleaned office buildings at night while working construction during the day. Her mother took in sewing work after finishing her shifts at a local restaurant. They had saved every penny to help Sarah through college and medical school, never once complaining about the financial strain. The military had been Sarah's way of serving her adopted country while building a career in medicine. it had provided structure, training, and opportunities she might never have had otherwise. But, sitting in that empty break room, she wondered if she had been naive to believe that her service and skills would be enough to overcome the barriers that still existed. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Chen entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who had been debating whether to have a difficult conversation. "I thought you might want some company," Dr. Chen said, offering one of the cups to Sarah. "And maybe we should talk about what happened out there." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the familiar aroma that had become a comfort during long shifts in the medical facility. "I'm not sure there's much to talk about, ma'am. Orders are orders." Dr. Chen settled into the chair across from her, her expression thoughtful. "Sarah, we've worked together for 3 years. I've watched you handle everything from routine medical exams to emergency trauma situations. You're one of the finest medical officers I've ever worked with." "Thank you, ma'am, but let me finish. Dr. Chen's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "What happened out there today wasn't about your qualifications or your readiness for deployment. I want you to understand that." The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to confront. Dr. Chen had been in the military for 15 years, serving multiple deployments and rising through the ranks at a time when even fewer women held leadership positions in the medical corps. If anyone understood the challenges Sarah faced, it would be her. "I've learned not to assume the worst about people's motives," Sarah said carefully, "but I can't help wondering if there were factors beyond mission requirements that influenced this decision." Dr. Chen nodded slowly, her expression suggesting she had been wrestling with the same questions. "I'd been thinking about that too. And, I'll be honest with you, I asked Barnes directly about the selection criteria. His answer wasn't entirely satisfying." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "What did he say?" "He mentioned concerns about team cohesion and unit dynamics. When I pressed him for specifics, he became vague." Dr. Chen paused, choosing her words carefully. It's possible he was referring to legitimate concerns about personality conflicts or working relationships. But, it's also possible that unconscious bias played a role in his assessment. The confirmation of her fears should have made Sarah angry, but, instead, she felt a deep sadness settling over her. She had worked so hard to prove that she belonged, to show that her gender and ethnicity were assets rather than liabilities. The thought that she might have been judged by criteria beyond her control was devastating. "What do I do with that information?" Sarah asked quietly. "How do I prove that I deserve to be treated fairly if the people making decisions don't even recognize their own biases?" Dr. Chen leaned forward, her expression intense. "You continue to be excellent at your job. You document everything. You build alliances with people who recognize your value. And, when the time is right, you speak up for yourself and for others who face similar challenges." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside. Both women turned as the door opened to reveal Master Sergeant Rodriguez, one of the senior non-commissioned officers in the medical unit. Rodriguez was a career soldier with 22 years of service, known for his direct manner and unwavering commitment to the soldiers under his command. "Dr. Chen, Martinez," he said, nodding to each of them in turn. "I wanted to have a word with you both about this morning's developments." Sarah felt her stomach tighten, wondering if Rodriguez was there to deliver additional bad news or to reinforce the decision that had already been made. But, his expression seemed more concerned than authoritative. "I've been thinking about the manifest changes," Rodriguez continued, "and I have some concerns about how those decisions were made. I wanted you to know that I've documented my observations and submitted them through appropriate channels." Dr. Chen and Sarah exchanged glances, both surprised by Rodriguez's unexpected advocacy. In Sarah's experience, senior non-commissioned officers rarely questioned the decisions of commissioned officers, especially when those decisions involved personnel assignments. "What kind of observations?" Dr. Chen asked. Rodriguez hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "Let's just say that the criteria used for selection weren't consistent with standard operating procedures. I've seen enough deployments to know when something doesn't add up. Sarah felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since learning she would be left behind. If Rodriguez had noticed irregularities and was willing to document them, perhaps her suspicions weren't unfounded. Perhaps there were people in positions of authority who would stand up for what was right. I appreciate your support, Master Sergeant, Sarah said, meaning every word. It means a lot to know that someone is paying attention. Rodriguez nodded grimly. I've got a daughter about your age, Martinez. She's studying to be a nurse. I want her to live in a world where she's judged by her abilities, not by what she looks like or where her family came from. After Rodriguez left, Sarah and Dr. Chen sat in contemplative silence for several minutes. The conversation had shifted something fundamental in Sarah's understanding of her situation. She wasn't imagining things, and she wasn't alone in recognizing that something was wrong. But recognition was only the first step. The real question was what she would do with this knowledge and how she would channel her frustration into positive action. As she sat in that break room, watching the afternoon sun cast changing shadows across the floor, Sarah began to formulate a plan that would extend far beyond the next 48 hours. The next 48 hours passed with agonizing slowness for Sarah Martinez. She threw herself into reviewing medical protocols and updating her knowledge of battlefield trauma procedures, but her mind kept wandering to her colleagues who were already establishing the field hospital overseas. Every few hours, she checked her phone for updates from the deployed team, feeling increasingly disconnected from the mission she had trained months to join. On the second morning, Sarah arrived at the airfield before dawn, determined to make the best impression possible for her delayed deployment. She had spent extra time ensuring her uniform was immaculate and her equipment was perfectly organized. If anyone was looking for reasons to question her professionalism, they would find none. Private Johnson stood near the same spot where they had been left behind 2 days earlier, but his demeanor had changed dramatically. Where he had been argumentative and frustrated before, now he appeared dejected and resigned. His shoulders slumped with defeat, and he avoided eye contact with the other personnel preparing for the flight. Sarah approached him cautiously, recognizing a fellow soldier who was struggling with circumstances beyond his control. "How are you holding up, Johnson?" He looked up with surprise, as if he hadn't expected anyone to acknowledge him, much less express concern for his well-being. "I've been better, Martinez." "You?" "Same," Sarah admitted. "Ready to get over there and do our jobs?" Johnson's expression brightened slightly at her matter-of-fact tone. "More than ready. I've been going crazy sitting around here while my unit is setting up operations without me." As they talked, Sarah noticed that other soldiers were maintaining their distance from both her and Johnson. The behavior was subtle but unmistakable. Conversations would stop when they approached, and people found reasons to move to different areas of the staging ground. The isolation felt deliberate and uncomfortable. Sergeant Williams appeared with the same clipboard he had consulted 2 days earlier, but this time his demeanor was different. He moved with jerky, nervous energy, and his eyes darted around the group without settling on any individual for more than a second. Something had clearly changed since their last interaction. "Listen up!" Williams called out, his voice carrying the authority of his rank despite the underlying tension. "We've got new orders regarding this flight." Sarah felt her heart sink, wondering if they were about to face another delay or complication. She watched Williams carefully, noting the way his hands trembled slightly as he consulted his notes. "There's been some reorganization of personnel assignments," Williams continued, stumbling slightly over his words. "Some of you will be reassigned to different units upon arrival." The announcement sent murmurs through the gathered soldiers, but Williams pressed on before anyone could ask questions. Sarah caught sight of Lieutenant Colonel Barnes standing near the aircraft, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with a woman in civilian clothes. The woman carried herself with unmistakable authority, and Barnes looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Martinez and Johnson," Williams called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Report to the aircraft for immediate boarding. Your unit assignments will be confirmed upon arrival." Sarah blinked in surprise, wondering if she had misheard. After being singled out for exclusion 2 days earlier, she and Johnson were now being prioritized for immediate boarding. The reversal was so dramatic that she couldn't help but feel suspicious about the sudden change. As they gathered their equipment and moved toward the aircraft, Sarah noticed more unusual activity around the staging area. Several officers she didn't recognize were observing the boarding process with intense scrutiny, taking notes and speaking in hushed tones among themselves. The atmosphere felt charged with tension that went far beyond normal deployment preparations. Private Johnson leaned close to her as they climbed the aircraft steps. "Something's different today. You notice all these extra people watching everything?" Sarah nodded, her training telling her to observe and adapt rather than speculate about matters beyond her control. But she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched for specific reasons related to what had happened 2 days earlier. Inside the aircraft, they found themselves seated near the front, in seats that had been specifically reserved for them according to the sergeant who showed them to their positions. The preferential seating was another anomaly that raised questions about why their status had changed so dramatically. As other soldiers boarded and found their seats, Sarah overheard fragments of conversation that made her stomach churn. Several soldiers were discussing the diversity quota for the deployment, speaking in code words that didn't hide their meaning. Others made jokes about political correctness and checking all the boxes when they thought she couldn't hear them. The casual racism and sexism wasn't new to Sarah, she had encountered it throughout her military career in various forms. But hearing it in the context of her recent exclusion and sudden reinstatement felt particularly painful. It suggested that her professional abilities were secondary to her demographic characteristics in the minds of some of her colleagues. Dr. Chen boarded the aircraft and paused beside Sarah's seat, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes conveying volumes. "I'm glad you made it onto this flight," she said quietly. "There have been some interesting developments over the past 2 days." Before Sarah could ask what she meant, Dr. Chen moved to her assigned seat several rows back. The cryptic comment left Sarah with more questions than answers, but she sensed that Chen was trying to communicate something important without drawing attention to their conversation. The aircraft engines roared to life, and Sarah felt the familiar mixture of excitement and anxiety that accompanied the beginning of any deployment. But, this time, the emotions were complicated by uncertainty about what had really happened and what it might mean for her future in the military. As the plane lifted off, Sarah caught sight of the civilian woman who had been speaking with Lieutenant Colonel Barnes. She was standing on the tarmac, watching the aircraft depart with an expression of grim satisfaction. Something about her presence suggested that she held significant authority, possibly enough to influence personnel decisions and deployment assignments. During the long flight, Sarah found herself analyzing every interaction and comment from the past few days, trying to piece together a complete picture of what had occurred. Master Sergeant Rodriguez's documentation of irregularities, Dr. Chen's cryptic references to developments, and the sudden reversal of her exclusion all pointed to something more complex than simple logistical adjustments. Private Johnson, seated beside her, seemed lost in similar thoughts. Neither of them spoke much during the flight, both processing the emotional whiplash of rejection followed by unexpected inclusion. The other soldiers around them maintained their distance, creating an invisible barrier that made the journey feel isolating despite being surrounded by colleagues. About halfway through the flight, Dr. Chen approached their seats carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who had made a difficult decision. She glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard, then leaned in close. "I need to tell you both something," she said quietly. "What happened 2 days ago wasn't an accident or a routine logistical decision. There were specific factors that influenced your exclusion from the first flight." Sarah's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "What kind of factors?" "The kind that violate military regulations and basic principles of fairness," Chen replied. Master Sergeant Rodriguez wasn't the only person who noticed irregularities. Several observations were documented and forwarded through appropriate channels. Johnson leaned forward, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Are you saying we were discriminated against?" Dr. Chen hesitated before answering, clearly weighing her words carefully. "I'm saying that decisions were made based on criteria that had nothing to do with your qualifications, performance, or mission requirements. And I'm saying that certain people in positions of authority took notice and demanded corrective action." The confirmation of what Sarah had suspected felt like a punch to the stomach. Knowing that her fears had been justified didn't make the situation easier to accept. If anything, it made her question every aspect of her military career and wonder how many other opportunities had been influenced by bias she hadn't recognized. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "Do we file formal complaints? Do we pretend this never happened?" "That's up to you," Chen replied. "But I want you to know that this incident has been elevated to people who care about ensuring fair treatment for all service members. Your exclusion from the first flight may have inadvertently exposed problems that needed to be addressed." After Chen returned to her seat, Sarah stared out the aircraft window at the clouds below, processing the revelation that her worst fears had been confirmed. The discrimination she had experienced wasn't imagined or paranoid speculation, it was documented fact that had required intervention from higher authorities to correct. The knowledge was empowering and devastating at the same time. She now had confirmation that she belonged on this deployment and that her exclusion had been unjust. But she also had to confront the reality that some of her colleagues and superiors saw her as something other than a qualified soldier and medical professional. Private Johnson broke the silence between them, his voice barely audible over the aircraft engines. "My grandfather was in the Korean War. He used to tell me stories about the discrimination he faced, how he had to work twice as hard just to be treated half as well as white soldiers." Sarah nodded, understanding the historical context that gave weight to their current situation. "My father always told me that things would be different for my generation, that merit would matter more than anything else." "Maybe it does matter more," Johnson replied thoughtfully. "Maybe that's why someone noticed what happened and did something about it. 50 years ago, we might have just been left behind with no recourse." The perspective offered some comfort, but Sarah still struggled with the emotional impact of being judged by characteristics beyond her control. She had built her identity around competence and professionalism, believing that excellence would insulate her from discrimination. Learning that excellence wasn't always enough felt like a fundamental challenge to her worldview. As the aircraft began its descent toward their destination, Sarah made a mental commitment to herself and to other soldiers who might face similar challenges. She would document everything carefully, build relationships with allies who recognized her value, and never let anyone question her dedication to serving her country. But she also acknowledged that her deployment would now carry additional weight beyond the medical mission she had trained for. Every decision she made, every patient she treated, and every interaction with colleagues would be scrutinized more intensely because of what had happened. The pressure to prove herself would be enormous. The aircraft touched down on a dusty airfield surrounded by temporary structures and military vehicles. Through the windows, Sarah could see the controlled chaos of a deployment in its early stages, soldiers unloading equipment, vehicles moving supplies, and the gradual emergence of order from apparent disorder. As they prepared to disembark, Master Sergeant Rodriguez appeared beside their seats with the same serious expression he had worn when documenting irregularities 2 days earlier. But, this time, his demeanor carried a note of satisfaction. "Martinez, Johnson," he said quietly. "When you get settled, I want you to know that certain people have been paying attention to how this deployment has been handled. Your performance over the next few months will be watched by individuals who care about fairness and competence." The comment was both encouraging and intimidating. Sarah understood that she was being given an opportunity to prove herself under circumstances that would carry more weight than a typical deployment. But she also recognized that the margin for error had been reduced to zero. As they stepped off the aircraft into the heat and dust of their deployment location, Sarah felt the weight of expectations settling around her like a heavy cloak. The next few months would test not only her medical skills and military training but also her resilience in the face of prejudice and her ability to maintain professionalism under pressure. Looking around at the temporary structures that would be her home for the foreseeable future, Sarah made peace with the reality that her deployment would be about more than treating wounded soldiers and providing medical care. It would be about proving that merit and character mattered more than superficial characteristics, and about ensuring that future soldiers wouldn't face the same barriers she had encountered. The mission ahead would be challenging enough under normal circumstances. But Sarah Martinez was no longer just a medical officer reporting for deployment. She was a symbol of change in an institution still grappling with its own biases and limitations. The field hospital was a testament to military efficiency and medical ingenuity. Within 72 hours of arrival, Sarah found herself working in a fully operational trauma center that had been constructed from modular components and staffed by some of the most skilled medical professionals in the armed forces. The controlled chaos of setting up the facility had given way to the rhythmic urgency of treating casualties from forward operating positions. Sarah's first week at the deployment site had been a whirlwind of activity that left little time for reflection on the circumstances that had brought her there. She worked 16-hour shifts, treating everything from routine injuries and illnesses to complex trauma cases that tested every aspect of her medical training. The work was exactly what she had prepared for, and she found herself falling into the familiar rhythm of military medicine. But, beneath the surface of professional competence, Sarah remained acutely aware that her every move was being observed and evaluated. The knowledge that her exclusion from the first flight had been documented and elevated to higher authorities meant that her performance would carry weight beyond the immediate medical mission. Every decision she made, every patient she treated, and every interaction with colleagues was potentially significant. The pressure might have been overwhelming for someone less prepared, but Sarah had spent years learning to perform under scrutiny. Her medical training had taught her to compartmentalize stress and focus on the task at hand, skills that proved invaluable in her current situation. If anything, the additional pressure seemed to sharpen her focus and enhance her performance. Dr. Patricia Chen had been watching Sarah's integration into the field hospital with the careful eye of someone who understood both the medical and political dimensions of their situation. Chen had worked to ensure that Sarah received challenging assignments that would showcase her abilities while providing opportunities to build relationships with key personnel throughout the medical unit. On her 8th day at the deployment site, Sarah was assigned to accompany a medical evacuation team to a forward operating base where several soldiers had been injured in an improvised explosive device attack. The assignment was significant because it would put her medical skills on display for personnel from multiple units while demonstrating her ability to perform under the extreme conditions of battlefield medicine. The helicopter ride to the forward base gave Sarah her first real view of the operational environment where she would be working for the next several months. The landscape below was a mixture of desert terrain and scattered settlements, marked by the geometric patterns of military installations and the improvised structures of local communities. The contrast between the ordered precision of military operations and the organic chaos of civilian life was stark and sobering. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, the senior medic accompanying the evacuation team, briefed Sarah during the flight about the casualties they would be treating. 3 soldiers had been injured when their vehicle struck an improvised explosive device while conducting a routine patrol. 2 had suffered serious but survivable injuries, while the third was in critical condition with multiple trauma requiring immediate surgical intervention. "The critical patient is going to need everything you've got," Rodriguez shouted over the helicopter noise. "Field surgery under fire isn't something they teach you in medical school." Sarah nodded, her mind already running through the procedures she might need to perform and the resources that would be available at the forward base. She had trained extensively for exactly these scenarios, but training could never completely replicate the stress and urgency of real battlefield conditions. The forward operating base was smaller and more austere than Sarah had expected, consisting of temporary structures surrounded by protective barriers and defensive positions. The medical facility was essentially a reinforced tent equipped with basic surgical equipment and staffed by a small team of medics and a single physician assistant. The casualties had been stabilized by the base medical team, but it was immediately clear that the critical patient needed surgical intervention that exceeded the capabilities of the forward facility. Sarah quickly assessed the situation and began preparing for a complex procedure that would need to be performed under less than ideal conditions. The soldier, a young specialist named Davis, had suffered severe abdominal trauma along with injuries to his left leg and arm. His vital signs were deteriorating despite the initial treatment he had received, and Sarah recognized that immediate surgery was the only option for saving his life. Working alongside the physician assistant and base medical team, Sarah performed emergency surgery in conditions that would have been challenging even in a fully equipped hospital. The procedure required all of her technical skills and medical knowledge, but it also demanded the kind of calm leadership that could only come from years of training and experience. As she worked to repair the soldiers' damaged organs and control internal bleeding, Sarah became aware that word of the surgery was spreading throughout the base. Soldiers who had no medical background found reasons to pass by the medical tent, and several officers made appearances to check on the status of the wounded men. The attention was both flattering and intimidating. Sarah understood that her performance in this high-stakes situation would be discussed and analyzed by people throughout the base and potentially beyond. The young specialist's life hung in the balance, but so did Sarah's reputation and future opportunities within the military medical system. After 2 hours of intensive surgery, Sarah had successfully stabilized Davis and prepared him for evacuation to a higher-level medical facility. The procedure had gone better than anyone had dared hope, and the soldier's prognosis had improved dramatically thanks to the surgical intervention she had provided. As the evacuation helicopter prepared to transport Davis and the other casualties to the field hospital, the base commander, Colonel Thompson, approached Sarah with an expression that mixed relief and professional respect. "That was outstanding work, Major Martinez," Thompson said, using a rank that Sarah hadn't heard applied to herself before. "You may have saved that young man's life." The comment about her rank caught Sarah off guard. She was currently a captain, not a major, but she didn't correct the colonel's mistake. The promotion might have been a slip of the tongue, or it might have reflected knowledge about pending changes to her status that she hadn't been informed about yet. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had observed the entire procedure, pulled Sarah aside as they prepared to return to the field hospital. Her expression was thoughtful and her tone carried the weight of someone who had seen many medical professionals work under pressure. "I've been doing this for 12 years, Rodriguez said quietly. "I've seen a lot of doctors and surgeons work in field conditions. What you did in there was exceptional, not just technically but in terms of leadership and decision-making under pressure." The praise felt genuine and earned, untainted by the political considerations that had complicated Sarah's deployment from the beginning. For the first time since arriving at the deployment site, Sarah felt confident that she was being judged purely on her professional abilities and performance. During the helicopter ride back to the field hospital, Sarah reflected on how the day's events had shifted her perspective on the challenges she faced. While the discrimination she had experienced was real and problematic, her response to those challenges would ultimately define her military career more than the obstacles themselves. The young specialist she had operated on would recover and return to duty because of her surgical skills. The base personnel who had observed her work would remember her competence and professionalism. The relationships she was building with colleagues like Staff Sergeant Rodriguez were based on mutual respect and shared commitment to their mission. Back at the field hospital, word of Sarah's successful surgery had already spread throughout the medical unit. Dr. Chin greeted her with undisguised pride and satisfaction, while Master Sergeant Rodriguez nodded approvingly as she passed him in the corridor. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. Colonel Matthews, the senior medical officer for the entire deployment, summoned Sarah to his office that evening for what he described as a routine debriefing about the day's medical evacuations. Matthews was a career military physician with nearly 20 years of service and multiple deployments. His reputation for demanding excellence and maintaining the highest standards of military medicine was well known throughout the medical corps. Sarah had never worked directly with him before, but she knew his assessment would carry significant weight for her future career prospects. "I've read the reports about today's surgical intervention," Matthews began without preamble. The base commander was effusive in his praise for your performance under pressure. Sarah remained at attention, unsure whether the meeting was heading toward commendation or criticism. Matthews had a reputation for being direct and sometimes harsh in his evaluations of medical personnel. "I've also been briefed on the circumstances surrounding your deployment to this location," Matthews continued, his expression becoming more serious. "There are aspects of that situation that reflect poorly on our institution and its commitment to fair treatment of all service members." The acknowledgement was more direct than anything Sarah had heard from other senior officers, and it carried the weight of someone in a position to influence policy and personnel decisions. "What I want you to understand," Matthews said, leaning forward in his chair, "is that your performance here